Namaste. Welcome to Urban Chatterati. This is Abhinav Prakash. And today I'm going to discuss with Abhijit Iyer-Mitra his account of travels in Afghanistan, where he met the Taliban commanders, where he also smoked Afghan hashish. Did you? Okay. So, Abhijit, welcome to the show.
Vetrivel, thank you for having me.
So, Abhijit, you wrote the account of your travels in Afghanistan, where you said that Taliban is a mentality, it's not an ethnicity. What do you mean by that?
So in India, there's this belief that somehow, the Taliban is very much a Pashtun, uh, ethno-nationalist and ethno-supremacist organization. It isn't, because when you go to Afghanistan, you realize there's a huge rural-urban divide. And 90% of Afghanistan is rural pretty much. And for them, and even in urban areas, the sort of rules that they live by, they're much they're very much in the Middle Ages. The mentality is very much in the Middle Ages, right? So when the Taliban comes and says you do something, it's not that they're imposing something new. It may be something new for 10% of the population that lives in the cities, but it's not new for 90% of the people who have lived in the villages. So as far as the people were concerned, when the Taliban was in power, it was merely for the Western press. It was things like women's rights, burqas, and minorities having to wear, saffron armbands like they did in Nazi Germany. But for the villages, it was for the first time in almost 20 years for them, it was peace and security. What very quick justice system. And for them, the concerns of the rest of the world and the English press didn't matter at all, right? And it wasn't Pashto. This sort of medieval mentality that exists in rural Afghanistan is common to the Uzbeks, it's common to the Tajiks, it's common to the Hazaras in the Shia parts, Herat and things like that. So it's common to almost all the ethnicities in in Afghanistan. So, there was nothing, and this is what really surprised me. So the main complaint that I found with the Shias and the Hazaras, because remember there are Shias who are not Hazaras as well,
Hmm.
was that as long as you leave us alone for being Shia, we don't give a damn.
So, they don't have any problem with Taliban otherwise.
Basically, the rural population does not. Large parts of, because remember, because of the war, there's been a significant rural to urban migration as well.
Hmm.
So even those parts don't. It's only the educated people there that seem to have a big problem with the Taliban. And again, with the Taliban, like I state in the report, to a man, they detest Pakistan.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So,
it's
tell us
much
more
more
about this.
complex.
Hmm.
It doesn't fall into easily categorizable silos.
Hmm. So tell us more about your travel in Afghanistan. How did you go there? There was a war going on, and I think you went in 2019. How did you travel in those, let's say, Taliban controlled territory? How was that possible? That's very interesting, Abhijit. And you have many such records of doing such things, which you don't say in public, but you can talk about Taliban in public.
Yeah, so look, it required a lot of research. Um, we had to coordinate with lots of people in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and especially to set up the meetings. The problem with the meetings then was that you'd never know if they're going to take you hostage or something like that, right? And I'd just gotten out of jail, so I didn't want to spend another 2 3 years holding up placards for my mom saying, please get me out of here, kind of videos to be circulated and so on and so forth. So it required a lot of planning, and it turned out that you have to be so careful even in the cities. We had to change drivers, we had to change the car rental agency. The car rental there is like car rental in India. You don't get the car minus the driver, you have to take the car with the driver. And so the car is reliable, the driver fundamentally is not. So you had to change that. You had to change the guide every single time. because in some places the Shia guides, they were mostly, I had educated Hazara guides. The thing was, in many cases, they won't want to. They knew the Taliban in some parts. In some parts, they did not know the Taliban. In which case, you had to take a guide who knew the Taliban, right, to act as intermediaries and things like that. So it was a very. It took me almost about 3-4 months of preparation and planning just to do that. Much more so than I have on any other trip.
Yes. So, how was the experience of traveling into Taliban controlled territory? And you basically write that there's not much difference between the Taliban and the general population, unlike what we think of sitting in India. So,
Right. So it's like saying there's a difference between Hindu nationalists and Indians. I
hmm,
mean, you and I are kind of Hindu nationalistic in a sense. But does that make us any less Indians?
hmm.
No. See, the
That's a very
Taliban.
dangerous. That's a very dangerous comparison you are drawing.
No, but remember, most of the Taliban aren't terrorists. This is what we have to understand. It is not a terror movement,
Hmm,
right? It's your normal Afghan patterns. It's the way people live. Afghanistan has always been a violent rural society.
hmm,
It's always been a pre-industrial society. And if you go check out their monuments and things like that, the scale of their monuments, Abhinav, it is the Islamic monuments, it is far more grandiose than anything you have in India till the Mughal period. And
hmm,
some of it is even more grandiose than the Mughal period. So
hmm,
remember, this is clearly a de-urbanized society,
hmm,
right? And the most grandiose monuments that you see are, in fact, not in the current urban centers, which means there was a shift in urbanization
hmm.
and a de-urbanization simultaneously happening.
So you went to different cities in Afghanistan. What was the
Uh,
difference between them?
we toured almost the whole of Afghanistan, Ghor, Ghazni, Nangarhar. I especially wanted to go into the Taliban infested provinces because otherwise, how are you doing primary research? Right. For most people these days who have so-called traveled to Pakistan, if they are goras, what they do is they go there in military convoys. They only talk from one military base to another military base. They can't really go out much, and they come back and write a report. And for most Indians, what they do is they scrounge off the reports of other people. The white research, they then go off that. So where's the point in that? I didn't want to do what everybody else was doing,
Hmm,
right? Because I felt that there was something to be learned. And this is what I normally do when people talk about bricks and things like that. Nobody actually wants to go talk to the people on the Obor and BRI. Nobody actually wants to go talk to the people who live along the Obor and BRI. I, on the other hand, go and do that because remember, the government view of things that you're given in five-star hotel lobbies in the capital is very different from what you hear from people on the ground. And people in India who understand the difference between Bharat and India, as Lalu Prasad Yadav put it, would understand what that means,
hmm,
right? So it was Kandahar, Herat, Ghor, Ghazni, Nangarhar, uh, uh, a total of about 7, 8, 9 provinces, all the major cities.
hmm,
I couldn't get to Jalalabad because there was some big event and fighting and some kind of a Taliban offensive happening. And when we say Taliban, we need to understand that there is a terroristic core to the Taliban, which is manipulated by Pakistan. But it is to Pakistan's credit how it manages to exploit tribal rivalry and normal fighting to create the Taliban into a fighting force as and when it requires.
hmm. Tell us more about it. I mean, how did, because you're saying they hate Pakistan, there's a universal hatred for Pakistan, but still Pakistan is such a big player out there that it can manage, it can pull the strings out there. How is it possible?
Right, because the feudal leadership of a lot of these tribes and clans and so on and so forth is controlled by Pakistan. Many of the families are held hostage by Pakistan.
Oh,
And right, and so all these feudal lords, in a sense, they exact corvée labor. So, like normally what used to happen was in the olden days, the king would say, I'm building a dam. Every household has to send at least one member to build the dam. Or I'm going on war, every member has to send at least one able bodied man to fight the war. It's the same system that goes on here. And because, remember, because it is such a fractured society, tribal and kinship systems are the only trust mechanism out there. There is no trust between the government and the people, governors and people. At no level of government is there any kind of trust. So you can only depend on kinship networks for trust. And when we say trust, it's a very loose term because in pre-modern societies, even that kinship is prone to fratricide and patricide and filicide and things like that. So for people who don't get that, that's killing your brother, killing your father, killing your son. It's a very common uh, power grab mechanism out there. So it's a very, very unstable society. We need to understand this. We are making the same mistake with Afghanistan, looking at it through an Indian lens, that the West does to India, looking at it through a postmodern industrial lens.
What is the Indian lens you're talking about here?
The Indian lens here is this narrative that there is no such thing as good Taliban, bad Taliban.
Hmm.
The narrative that this is a Pashto ethno nationalist movement. All of that just came crashing down because I met so many Tajik and Uzbek Taliban. It wasn't even funny,
Hmm. Okay.
right?
But you also mentioned there's a regional variation in the intensity of Taliban
Yeah.
control and also in their view towards India. So you said that the Hindustan is a kind of a magic word in some parts of Afghanistan, but in other parts it's like it just doesn't matter.
So in most of Afghanistan, it's a magic word, except in Kandahar. And the problem was because in Kandahar, my position had been compromised. I had to be evacuated very, very quickly because news had already spread that there was this fat Indian who was going around interviewing people. I couldn't stay and find out. That was the big lacuna in my research, that I wasn't able to find out why India never seemed to make a difference in Kandahar.
Hmm.
Whereas in other, even Pashtun dominated regions, if you're an Indian, you're treated like a VIP.
Mhm.
Right. So for the first few days, I had a foreign researcher with me. And normally, in India, for example, if you're a Gora or a Desi, the Gora will get all the attention. They're like, oh, you're Gora, we're not interested in you. Oh, you're from India, wonderful. We want to sit down, we want to talk to you. We want you to have tea. How do you like my cooking? How do you like my mother's cooking? So on and so forth. Right.
Wow.
So yeah, and it's like that in a few countries. Afghanistan isn't the only country like that. So if you go to Israel, for example,
Hmm.
if you're Indian, they'll be extra sweet to you. Okay, if you go to Egypt, especially, I don't know if I've related this to you, but when we were outside the Cairo Museum to see the Great Mask of Tutankhamun and all the Tutankhamun, amongst other things, I mean, the Ramesses and Seti and all those treasures as well in the Cairo Museum, you have to go very, very early, and there's a line that's already about a kilometer long by 6 a.m. Right. And somebody had told my mom, just wear a bindi and sari and be in a bindi and sari in Egypt all the time. So she did. And this guard, he saw that my mom was in a bindi and sari, and we were carrying this photo of my mom with Amitabh Bachchan long back. Right. This was taken almost all, probably even before I was born. I don't know. Quite some time back. It is a black and white photo. So he comes up and he's like, are you Indian from India? Yes, yes, yes. And I had the good sense to flick out that photo and say, we're also friends of Amitabh Bachchan. By this time, he'd already dragged us by a hand. We didn't know what he was doing. So we thought he was taking us somewhere, kicking us out of the line or something. This was our first day. It was our very first day in Cairo. So we didn't know what to expect. He dragged us right to the front of the queue. And even before the opening, he pushed us through the doors.
Wow.
Right. And it's like that throughout Cairo. Egypt loves Indians,
Hmm.
right? And especially if you're friends with Amitabh Bachchan, it gets you even more points.
Even today.
Even today.
Why?
Well, this was in 2007,
Yeah.
so 14 years on.
Yeah.
But still,
But let's say
it's
there's a
my
goodwill for Indians in many countries. Uh,
lots.
and in Afghanistan, I mean, what kind of goodwill did you felt in the sense that how did it
It,
help you in
it
your
was
research?
always, it used to turn from indifference to affection.
Hmm.
You'd always be invited to sit down. You'd always be invited to have a chat. You'd always be invited to have tea. All right. Whereas there was complete indifference. I mean, there was a politeness, but there was an indifference for other people.
And what did they say about India?
Usually, the thing is, thank you so much. You're such a kind people. You're helping us so much. And then they talk about, historical ties and things like that. Mostly, they'd end up talking about Hollywood movies and Indian food.
Hmm.
Sorry, Bollywood movies, which as you know, I'm not very good at. So my standard go-to is Salman Khan and Amitabh
Hmm.
Bachchan. Okay, when I'm in doubt, you say Salman Khan and Amitabh Bachchan.
Hmm.
But they'd start singing for you all wrong words. They think they are. It's the way they hear it that they're singing it.
Hmm.
But yeah. But look, this was kind of superficial because the moment India puts boots on the ground out there,
Yeah.
you'll be seen as an occupier and all that goodwill will vanish.
Yes, but
Right.
this is a common people you are talking about. But what about the Taliban when they hear that you are from India?
So
What is
here's
their
the
behavior?
point. That's what I'm saying. There is no difference. The Taliban are extremely, all the Taliban I met, without exception, they detest Pakistan.
Hmm.
And if you're an Indian, they love you.
Okay.
Right. And it doesn't matter you're a kafir, you're a Hindu. They
Hmm.
just love you for being an Indian.
Okay.
Right.
That's something.
So it's very problematic. So this is why all the narratives you hear that are so black and white. Look, black and white narratives are generally very problematic. But they get much more problematic in Afghanistan because there's so much nuance to this. The issue is that they will go fight the government because the government's governors and local provincial leaders are highly rapacious, corrupt, and compromised. So they will always cause some kind of tribal hurt or harm or injury, which then requires the settlement of scores, an eye for an eye kind of justice. And then when you support the government, it automatically becomes against you.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
That said, the organized Taliban leadership, and this is where we need to differentiate between organized Taliban and disorganized Taliban. 99% of the Taliban would probably be disorganized Taliban, from what I saw. About 1% would be organized Taliban because I remember I did meet fairly senior commanders as well,
Hmm.
who also hate Pakistan, who have no option because their families are in Pakistan,
Hmm.
right? Or they will get killed. So there is a level of ISI control, which then the ISI uses as and when it wants to stage certain attacks or overrun certain provinces and things like that.
Hmm. 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 You were also talking about it on the way you saw that this armed militia of the people who is like roaming around the countryside, and in the convoys of the Afghan army and convoys of American army, they're just passing by and they're not even fighting, they're not even engaging with each other.
They don't engage. It's kind of it's a sort of gentleman's agreement. We will fight where the fighting is there.
Hmm.
Outside that area, we will not fight. So you'll see a lot of people who look like Taliban walking on the road, and you'll see Afghan army or American army convoy or Marine convoys, whatever, pass by. They'll do nothing.
Okay. And what is the situation now in Afghanistan? Because it seems that Taliban is gaining an upper hand again.
Right, they are, and they probably will because when you say Taliban is gaining an upper hand, who exactly is gaining the upper hand? It's sort of a amorphous tribal confederacy which keeps
Hmm.
a tribal confederacy whose composition keeps shifting and changing.
Hmm.
Right. One day they'll be fighting against you, one day they can fight for you. This is why good Taliban, bad Taliban doesn't help, because all you need to do is bribe them more than the other person to come over to your side.
Hmm.
Right. So it's not an easy to navigate place when you look at it from the prism of a established state like India.
Hmm. So you
So
made a
they
very
so yeah.
you made a very important point that we have to look at Afghanistan as a tribal confederacy rather than a modern state, right? So what implication does it has for the policy which India should follow towards Afghanistan?
Right now our policy is pretty damn good. What you need to do is need to find your one strong man or whoever, even Amrullah Saleh, because Amrullah Saleh gets this.
Hmm.
Right. It doesn't matter what he says in public. In private, I'm sure he's a very smart man, he gets this. You let him be president, you stop interfering, you give him the arms that he wants. Just give him arms, not troops, arms and money. That is all they require. I want to remind you that even after the Soviets withdrew,
Hmm.
the embryonic Taliban at that point, which at that point may have been more organized. I don't know. I can't comment on how the Taliban was during the IC 814 hijacking because I wasn't there. I can only comment about the Taliban as they exist today. Right. What happens here is in the 1990s, the Pakistanis tried to capture Jalalabad, and it was basically Pakistani army brigades and artillery supporting an ostensibly Taliban offensive against Jalalabad. The Afghan army thrashed the Pakistanis. Right? They started crumbling when the Soviet Union collapsed and Afghanistan wasn't getting either military aid or financial aid. The Afghans are more than capable of managing their own business. We need to stop having this patronizing attitude that both India and the West seem to have this patronizing attitude, but it's different. The West believes that democracy, quote unquote, will collapse in Afghanistan without, and human rights will collapse in Afghanistan without the white man's intervention.
Hmm.
And India, for its part, believes that everybody who is fighting against the government in Afghanistan is essentially a Pakistani.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right? Not true.
Hmm.
Understand that there are many people I met who probably want to kill the Afghan president who absolutely detest Pakistan.
Hmm.
That doesn't make them Pakistani.
So, what is the current policy of India towards Afghanistan?
The current policy is we do what Hillary Clinton did. We club them as a basket of deplorables.
Hmm.
We refuse exactly what Hillary did in her election against Trump, right? When you say everybody's a deplorable, they have no option except to go to bunch
Against it.
themselves up together.
Hmm.
If you don't treat them like that, what happens is it breaks up into the confederacy. They don't see Pakistan as a natural ally, and then Pakistan's levers for action are much reduced out there,
Hmm.
right? Which is why the policy needs to be very clear. You pick your man in Afghanistan, offer him unstinting financial aid, knowing full well that 90% of that will be pilfered off into their Swiss bank accounts. Okay. Uh, and military aid, and just let them run their own damn country.
Hmm.
Okay, if they are making peace with Taliban, let them make peace with the Taliban. Remember the Mujahideen, Ahmad Shah Massoud. Who is the Afghan government we were supporting, boss? They were all the Mujahideen that were opposing Najibullah, our friend Najibullah, and our friend the Soviets, who detested India for supporting Najibullah and the Soviets. And the moment they came to power, they turned anti-Pakistan and pro-India.
Yeah.
Right? Abdullah lives in Delhi.
Yeah.
Okay, he's got a house in Lutyens, Delhi.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Right? So who exactly are you saying are Pakistanis out here?
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Let the
There's no
way
permanent loyalties out there. There's no.
exactly understand that
Hmm.
there are no permanent loyalties out there.
But when talking about Afghanistan, we can't forget what China is doing out there. What is the Chinese game in Afghanistan? Because we have seen recently that Afghan government publicly called out the several Chinese diplomats as the spies who are interfering in Afghanistan.
So the Chinese presence is non-existent, and knowing the Chinese, they never do. They are much more the upper level schmoozers, right? They go bribe businessmen or tribal warlords and things like that. Their ground research is non-existent. If you talk to the Chinese foreign ministry or even the People's Liberation Army in Beijing, with so-called India experts, their knowledge of India is acutely limited. And unlike India, which has a small diplomatic service and not enough of a human investment budget, these people have huge budgets. They still don't do proper human research because they don't. If white people stick out like a sore thumb, Chinese diplomats stick out like an even sorer thumb.
Mhm.
Right? So they're completely incapable of getting proper information on the ground as far as I've seen. So they
Hmm.
may be spying, they may be trying to bribe people and things like that. But the Chinese visibility out there is non existent.
So are they operating through Pakistan?
They mostly must be operating through Pakistan, I suspect,
Hmm.
because wherever you go, you can talk to people who have benefited from some Indian agricultural project or things like that. You can't find a single person who's benefited from a Chinese project,
Okay. Hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So it's again, it's extremely complex. We need to, you know how much I like to black and white things, because policy is all about black and whiting. And my black and white suggestion is, so this is where the academic meets the policy person. I'm trying to give you the nuance of the situation, and the black and white policy suggestion is, get off your goddamn high horse, just give money and arms to some Afghan government. They will fundamentally be pro India, because the natural geopolitics of Afghanistan means they will be pro India, unless the leadership is so completely in awe or compromised, or are so religiously inclined,
Yeah.
uh, like the Taliban was in 1998, 99, that they will do Pakistan's bidding.
Hmm.
Okay. The point here is that the Taliban has broken down so much, you have so many levers to play. Because then, if you then say this is good Taliban, this is bad Taliban, the bad Taliban also want to become the good Taliban, because who wants to spend their whole life fighting? They
Yeah.
also want the benefits of, uh, sitting at home doing bacha bazi, or having a harem of 100 wives, or whatever it is.
So what about Pakistan, Abhijit? So we see there's a whole movement of the Pashtuns who are living in Pakistan against the Pakistani army, and Pashtuns across the border are also hostile towards the Pakistan. So what is the game of Pakistan? Is it going to face a blowback, or it is going to reassert control over Afghanistan?
I don't think they can reassert control over Afghanistan. If you look historically, the 2, 3, 4 years that the Taliban was in power was the only time that there was a government in Kabul that was hostile to India. Since this last 70 years of independence, except for those 4 years, the Afghan government has always been anti-Pakistan and pro-India,
Hmm.
right? And it doesn't matter who it is. It can be a Mujahideen government, it can be a royalist government, it can be a communist government. They're all pro-India.
Hmm.
What we need to understand is that the Taliban is exactly like the Mujahideen.
Hmm.
There is a big pro India faction in there as well, if only you give them the opportunity and don't keep spitting on their face every time they won't even approach you.
Hmm.
The point is, don't alienate them. When they come to power, they'll automatically turn pro India.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. At the same time, ensure that your chosen people maintain the upper hand.
Hmm.
So let them work out their coalitions themselves.
Hmm.
Now, when it comes to Pashtuns in Pakistan, I don't agree that they are so against. It's a very different, even though it's a continuation of the same conflict, contiguous, ethnically and geographically contiguous. The nature of the conflict there is different, because these are the different factions, different Islamic factions, the different tehzeebs within Islam that are fighting in the Northwest Frontier Province against the Pakistani government. So TTP again would have a different kind of religious inclination from somebody else fighting against the Pakistani government. That said, 35% of the Pakistan army is Pashtun. It's a disproportionate number of the officer corps that are Pashtun,
But
more
that
than
is
the
why the
Punjabis even.
Pakistan is vulnerable to this kind of threat.
Right. And that is why they use Islam to trump ethnicity.
Hmm.
In Bangladesh, they were hoping that religion would trump language.
Hmm.
In Afghanistan, they're hoping religion will trump ethnicity.
Hmm.
And in some levels, it works, because you look at the Pashtuns in the Pakistan army, they are heavily Punjabized.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like almost like a I hate to say Punjabi colonial project, because it is kind of a Punjabi colonial project, but it's a bit more.
Hmm.
It's where Islam as such, and a certain Punjabi interpretation of Islam, uh, is the accepted norm.
Hmm.
And so you conform to that, and therefore through that you become a Pakistani.
Hmm.
Right. So
That's a
I
very
still,
important point.
it is. And that is why the Pakistanis aren't going to succeed in Afghanistan, and the Afghans aren't going to succeed in Pakistan,
Hmm. It's going to be a permanent mess, basically.
basically.
But that has been the fate of the northwestern frontier of India for
for a
millennia.
very long time. For a very
It
long
has never
time.
been stable, except
It
maybe that Bactria and all those period when you had some trade and commerce and monasteries out there. I don't think it has ever been stable.
it maybe it was at one point of time. Certainly, you look at the caliber of monuments.
Hmm.
The kind of feudal society you see today was incapable of making those monuments. Economic impossibility.
Hmm.
Okay, so it must have definitely been an urbanized place, which, because of climate change or whatever, has descended into significant feudalism.
What is the time period we're talking about?
Sometime between, say, 1000 to 2000, a 1,000 year time gap.
So it will be very grateful if you can suggest some readings on that for the audience.
I've been searching for readings and I haven't found them because, see, Afghanistan's history is almost completely unexplored. Tell
Hmm.
me one great book you've read on the Kushans and on Afghan history. We read about monuments, but we don't read about archaeology.
But then archaeology in the entire Indian subcontinent is almost non-existent. So
True,
in
archaeology
the
in the
case
whole
of
of the
India, we
Indian.
don't have any evidence.
True, but at least in India and Pakistan, there is some archaeology taking
Hmm.
place.
Hmm.
Whereas in a conflict society like Afghanistan, which the major advances in archaeology have been over the last 40 years,
Hmm.
and Afghanistan has been bogged down in civil war for the last 40 years.
Agreed.
So
Agreed.
none of the modern analytical techniques have been used in Afghanistan.
Mhm. So Abhijit, the final question, the big picture of the Afghanistan. This is the place where Indian subcontinent, Iranian influence, Chinese, and Central Asia meet, right? And Central Asia, then you can also go towards the Russia. What is the big game going on in Afghanistan and in the wider Central Asia? If you look at Russia, China, Iran, West, and India, and of course Pakistan in between.
So everybody thinks they're playing the big game, but the Afghans are playing all of them. Right. And unfortunately, instead of making the lives of the Afghans better, we're screwing the Afghans over very, very badly. The West is screwing them over with their definition of democracy and human rights. Russia, Pakistan, and China are screwing them over for their extraction. Russia is screwing them over because to contain America. China is screwing them over because they have certain extractive mineral needs from Afghanistan. Pakistan is screwing them over because we have strategic depth requirements or whatever out there. And India is screwing them over by refusing to understand what they want and imposing our own vision of what it should be on them.
And Iran.
Iran is basically playing your Shia game, right?
Hmm.
They're playing the Shia game quite
That's the only
well.
game Iran knows, it seems.
Hmm?
That's the only game Iran knows.
That's the only card Iran has.
Yeah.
It doesn't have any other cards left.
Mm.
Because remember, in 1979, when the Islamic Revolution happened, it was actually ahead of South Korea and Taiwan.
Oh,
Yeah, it was.
in per
Uh,
capita terms.
yeah, today it would be a full on first world country had the Shah continued.
Hmm.
It did not.
Hmm.
So they are a country whose industrialization was aborted. They've been stuck in a sort of time warp since then. They miscalculated badly, too many wars that they've blundered into, too many foreign policy, too much concern for ideology, and too little concern for their own people.
Yes.
And imagine, Shia Islam was much stronger under the Shah than
That
it is
is
today.
today. Yeah.
It may be in power, but being in power is not the same as being powerful. What
There's
is the
lots of
point of
discontent.
having an arc of influence from Syria to Herat, down to Sana'a, Yemen in the south, but being perpetually in war, impoverished, famined, sanctioned, being slaughtered and butchered every day,
Hmm.
right? So these are all very personalized notions of what power is, what glory is, what fame is, what foreign policy is.
Hmm. Interesting, but you have not written everything in your account because I'm pretty sure there are much more to your travels in Afghanistan. Uh, is there any plan to write it down?
Look, I could possibly write a whole book.
Please do that.
No, I don't want to because it's a
Publish it
very
10 years later, but write it down now before you forget everything.
yeah, I've already done a lot of that. It's just
Oh.
that it's such a cherished, it's a very personal memory for me.
Mm, mm,
I
mm.
think as much as I enjoy my annual holiday trips to Italy or Europe or whatever, it's trips like this where you learn so much, which proves every assumption you held wrong. And a country becomes a guru. And so
Yes.
you end up respecting it and worshiping it, because anybody that gives you education is worth respecting and worshiping.
Yes, Abhijit. So, are there some interesting videos and pictures that you would share later on, or you
I
will
have
not do
lots,
that?
but it's. I think I don't want to go to jail again or set off a riot. So I mostly will not be sharing most of the pictures that I took in
There are a
Afghanistan.
couple of things which will make you win election in India any day.
There are, but I'm not going to be sharing them publicly.
But anyways, Abhijit, thanks for talking to us, and thank you, audience, for listening. And please do not forget to subscribe to the channel. And there's also the option to join the channel, a membership program. Please do check it out. Thank you.
Well, well, very well.